Hello and welcome to the special edition of the National Security Conversation. 20 years ago on this day, on September 11, 2001, planes hijacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists crashed into the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon building. The 9/11 attacks drew the United States into its longest war. According to a report from the Cost of War project at the Brown University, the war on terror cost United States some $8 trillion and killed 900,000 people, including United States military members, allied fighters, opposition fighters, civilians, journalists, and humanitarian aid workers who were killed as a direct result of the war, whether by bombs, bullets, or fire. Apart from this, there are uncounted numbers of those who died by way of displacement, disease, and hunger caused by this war. The foundations of the post-Cold War order appear less resilient after 20 years of war on terror than they did on September 11, when the United States was the sole superpower. A rising China bent on building its own global order in the shape of the Belt and Road Initiative poses a far more daunting challenge. Then there are uncertainties brought about by a global pandemic, COVID-19, that has sent economies into recession and killed millions around the globe. Where does the world stand today on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks? What is the state of the international system today as a result of the US war on terror? What will be the legacy of America's longest war that ended in images of desperate Afghans falling from a rescue aeroplane, reminiscent of the images of the man jumping out of the Twin Towers after 9/11? To discuss these issues, I have with me three distinguished guests. Professor C. Mohan is the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He is one of India's leading thinkers on foreign and security policy. He is the author of several acclaimed books, including Crossing the Rubicon and Samudra Manthan. Tamanna Salikuddin is the director of South Asia programs at the United States Institute of Peace, where she oversees USIP's work on Pakistan and broader South Asia. She joined the USIP after 12 years in the US government, focused on South Asia and conflict resolution. And finally, Max Rodenbeck is the South Asia Bureau Chief of the Economist. He is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books and the author of a critically acclaimed history of Cairo, the Egyptian capital. So welcome all of you to the National Security Conversation. Thank you for joining today. Let me begin with you, Professor Rajamohan. 20 years later, how do you assess the legacy of 9/11 and the global war on terror that came in its wake? What has been the impact of the war on terror on the global balance of power? You're muted, Professor Rajamohan.
No, on the first part of on the legacy, no, I think there was so much of over-determination of the threats by the United States and the sense of fear that came in and the kind of motivations that the Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden brought about, both in retrospect were excessive. I mean, if you look back at 20 years, Bin Laden's goals of destroying American power, of driving Americans out of the region, of overthrowing the existing order in the Arab world, and of mobilizing the faithful against the infidel in one big fight. None of that has happened. Like many of the millenarian movements before, I think they've exhausted itself. The movement is very deeply divided. In terms of its achievements, looking at those who planned and motivated it, is been fairly limited in terms of their impact on the world. They're still around. These kind of eruptions will continue to take place, but I don't think they've made any fundamental difference to the international system. The state has come back much stronger in the name of fighting terror, whether in democracies or otherwise. States found ways of coping with this challenge across the board, and no dramatic incident of the scale of 9/11 has taken place. So states today are stronger in dealing with terrorism. I don't know if it's good for democracy, but states have found a way to deal with terror. So my sense is no fundamental change has taken place. But on the balance of power, you could make an argument. The Americans spending $8 trillion, as you said in your opener, and getting into a whole lot of ill-conceived schemes, like promoting democracy in the Middle East, looking for nuclear weapons that obviously were not there in Iraq. The adventures in the Middle East actually gave China, I think, a time to consolidate itself. So in a sense, China's rise, it had 2 decades of unhindered opportunity. But my sense is the China's rise and the new confrontation between US and China, I don't think the balance of power has changed so much that the US cannot come back. The US resources are strong. China has its own vulnerability. China has risen in the last 20 years. It poses a challenge to the US, but that does not mean the US is fundamentally weakened vis-a-vis China. So my sense, the US, one of its curses is that it has extraordinary margin for error. It keeps erring on that margins, but it has the resources and the resilience to come back. And I think we're already seeing some of that.
Thank you. Tamanna, let me come to you next. This is an interesting point that Professor Mohan made, that the American war on terror somehow gave China the time to consolidate its power and make an impact on the global stage. But apart from that, how do you make sense of this rather crude irony that after a 2-decade-long global war on terror, there is soon going to be a Taliban-led or Taliban government in Afghanistan, at least 14 of whose cabinet members are on the United Nations Security Council blacklist. So in this context and in your judgment, how successful was America's longest war?
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Happymon, and happy to be here with you. I think this is a time for some humility, right? It's easy for us to look back and say this is where we went wrong, or blame others. Other countries did this and we did this wrong. I mean, there were a lot of mistakes, I think, first and foremost on the part of U.S. foreign policy, but I think none of us could have foreseen this complete rise of the Taliban in the way that the Taliban was able to take over Afghanistan so quickly. And it is, I think, a failure of, we didn't win this war. I think we do need to be honest about that. And, lots of lives were lost, a lot of resources were spent, and a lot of time was spent. I think it is important to think about it from a U.S. strategic perspective. As Professor Mohan said, there is the room for this error that I think the U.S. system is resilient enough to accept it. I think from a political perspective, a domestic political perspective in the United States, withdrawal at any point would have been messy, but withdrawing in the end will largely be seen as something that is in U.S. national security interests. I would look at the war in 2 parts. One, really, the real failure and misadventure was this idea that we could rebuild Afghanistan into a democracy, that we could install or help prop up a government that we found to be acceptable, and that really wasn't the case. I think fully understanding what is the myriad of Afghanistans, right? There is not one Afghanistan, and understanding the needs of people, understanding their desires, it was not something that our blunt military instrument could really accomplish. And we tried for many years in many different ways. I think where we're slightly more successful was obviously on the counterterrorism front. You could argue that there were no further attacks like 9/11 in the United States. How much of that is actually due to our war in Afghanistan is debatable. Much of it may be from the hardening domestically and the increased focus on terrorism. But I think in terms of diminution of Al-Qaeda and others, you could argue there were some successes. But in terms of how we're leaving Afghanistan, any of the progress, I would argue, in 20 years, yes, the US had a part in it, but Afghans had a part in it. I don't think we should forget the Afghan agency. We often think Afghan women have come a long way. Yes, Afghan women themselves fought to come a long way, and I don't want to paint them as a monolith or as victims. So I do think this is a very mixed record, and we have to acknowledge and have humility in what we were not able to accomplish in Afghanistan.
Fair enough, Tamanna. I think there are questions related to what do we do with what is happening in Afghanistan. I think those questions we'll come back to shortly. But Max, let me come to you with a larger conceptual question here, and that is, the whole the logic of humanitarian intervention and regime change. Is that now a thing of the past? What then happens to the principles of human rights when there is no superpower or a coalition of willing to enforce them at a time when the UN is looking at its weakest, really? Or was humanitarian intervention an ill-conceived idea to begin with? I think the contradiction really is this: on the one hand, as Professor Mohan said, the state is back, and pretty strongly so, and that may have implications for democracy and human rights. On the other hand, there is very little appetite in the international community to sort of go after the bad actors, as it were. What's your take on it, Max?
Well, I think first we have to be careful that there's a spectrum between humanitarian intervention and regime change. I mean, it's not necessarily wise to lump them all in the same basket. I mean, there are forms of intervention. All of them may have some degree of altruism, but ultimately they're expressions of power, and who has the power to do these kinds of things. Obviously, the United States was kind of the dominant power in the world for such a long time, and when the United States wanted these things to happen, they tended to happen. Clearly there's a change in power structure, power relationships, and there's no question that there's this relative decline of the United States. I mean, it's a slow decline. This Afghan episode with its sort of rather humiliating end is just one little marker along the way, and it's not a decline because America is a failure. It's just because the rest of the world is becoming richer and stronger. So I mean, there's something inevitable about this, and the question really moving forward is who's going to build the kind of consensus that's needed. It's not a question of whether there will be no more interventions of any kind, but you need to build a consensus in the world to make such things happen. Who's going to make that happen? Is the U.S. Reverting more to working with its allies, less as a lone actor? This seems to be clear under the Biden administration, and moving forward, it's likely to happen because of America's relative decline in power. So there is, the West is still there, and the West is still there as the force which basically constructed the post-World War II system. I mean, it's still in place, weakened, et cetera, but there isn't anything right now that looks about to replace it. So the question is, whether moving forward, this West as a construct, so-called West, still remains attractive to the rest of the world. Does it still remain the sort of, a pole of some kind, a moral pole, perhaps to some degree, about how to behave in the world? And can it pull the rest of the world with it? That's actually an open question. And then and a very big part of that question is, to what extent will this kind of West maintain an adversarial type of relationship to China and to China's allies? Increasingly, Russia is emerging as a straightforward ally of China. Is this a polarization that's going to replicate the Cold War? Or, will there be some wisdom out there, and perhaps we can move beyond this sort of adversarial type relationship? So I think there's still a lot of questions out there. But the type of sort of a coalition intervention that we saw in the moment of unipolar American power in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, that is likely to have passed for now. Which may not be such a bad thing, frankly, but I think we can say that that's probably passed for now. But there may still be other forms of humanitarian intervention when necessary, perhaps we would hope with a bit more wisdom attached, and less of the sort of mission creep failure which infected the whole Afghanistan project from the beginning.
Right, Max. Tamanna, let me take that question to you before I go to Professor Mohan with a different question. Is there any more appetite in the United States today to set things right in the world, or are we likely to witness a neo-isolationist foreign policy in the United States? What impact will that have on global security, as it were? What's your take?
I do think that the isolationist sort of tendencies, and you find them both on the right and the left in the United States. There's a fatigue and a real exhaustion, I think, from 2 decades of war. And also, I think there is some sense, definitely after Iraq, there is questioning of whether shaping everything through that terrorist lens, is it still that post 9/11 period? And I would argue that is really over. And the real shift in US foreign policy is actually underway now, where you see, for the first time since the Soviet collapse, a near peer competitor emerging in the shape of China. And I think there's real bipartisan support in the United States for being tough on China. And so where you're going to see US action or US willingness to not be isolationist is going to be in the form of deterring China, standing up to China. But I think when it comes to humanitarian adventurism, you are going to have some reticence, right? You're not going to get those full, almost 100% votes in favor of going in to intervene in some country. That being said, there are very few wars or conflicts left in the world that are purely civil conflicts. Whether they're conflicts in Africa or the Middle East or elsewhere, these are great power conflicts, right? And Russia and China are involved. And so I think you could see that being the motivation through which the United States can convince itself and convince its publics that it needs to go in and intervene someplace. But I would not underestimate the real sense of fatigue and questioning within systems, within military about post-Afghanistan. But I don't think you will see the United States back out there. Again, sometimes we don't learn those lessons of the past. I hope that this time, when there is some intervention, obviously I think there will be much more limited interventions. And there are a lot more places that I think the United States would be willing to intervene in a limited factor, in a quieter way than these big splashy wars that you've seen over the last 2 decades.
Right. Professor Rajamohan, if you look at the international system today, probably we are looking at a lessening of some of the smaller conflicts, around the world. But on the other hand, there seems to be a, spiking of the systemic tension, as it were. There seems to be emerging a counterpole to the United States, Russia, China, Iran, and perhaps Pakistan, Turkey, and Afghanistan, Taliban-led Afghanistan. If that were to be accurate, if that assessment were to be accurate, what impact will this have on the international system? Are we looking at the beginning of a new Cold War, quote unquote, or am I being paranoid about it?
No, there is no question. There is US-China rivalry, which is intensified. But I don't know if you can call it a Cold War yet, because the nature of the interdependence between US and China is so deep. They're still each other's largest trading partner. If you talk to Silicon Valley, if you talk to Wall Street, they love China. They still want to make money on China. So it's not as if, it's going to be a long haul. But I think they talk about a counter coalition. That too, I think, is premature. If all the countries you mentioned, every one of them will give their right hand if they can do a deal with the Americans. So it's not as if they've shut the doors. I mean, Chinese have been teasing the Americans, telling the Goldman Sachs, please, you're welcome, come back, let's come to a new understanding. You leave Asia, we'll take care of it. So Chinese are teasing the Americans. They've not given up, but they fight back if Americans fight back. So Russians too. I mean, it's not as if they've taken a fundamental decision like the Soviet Union. They have to confront their problem is they're not getting a reasonable deal from the terms. Not that it's not a principle. It is a price that what they're negotiating, and they don't have it yet, but maybe someday they'll have. Turkey is a member of NATO. So I think, Iran wants a nuclear deal, and how, again, the problem of terms. In fact, if Iran helped the Americans after 9/11, it was the Americans who kicked them in the teeth and said, look, you're part of the axis of evil. So I think I think we should jump to the conclusion that building coalitions is not easy. The bunch of countries you mentioned, even if you put all of them together, they would match America and Europe together. Right? So to suggest somehow, these guys are going to be at a counterpole, I mean, there's nowhere near it. So I think US has its problems. But if you put US and Europe together, and Japan, which is an ally, I'm not even talking about the Quad and all, just the three of them, historical allies. That is a powerful combination. I mean, they have the resources, capabilities. The question is whether they use it wisely is a different story. But as far as balance of power is concerned, I don't see this coalition is anywhere near. Two of them are dysfunctional, and I don't see how they can provide an alternative. Throw in Pakistan, Iran. What can they do to shift the balance of power?
So how is this tension between China and the United States going to play out eventually? Are they going to play out in peripheries in the South China Sea, in South Asian region? Where is it going to sort of play out, this tension?
It seems to cover everything. I mean, at this point, not just on the military side, Chinese would like to see Americans go home from the first island chain, so that their local hegemony can be kept. They think they owe themselves to build a new order in Asia that suits them. They're going to try to. Americans are saying no. We're going to stick around. We're going to produce deterrence and balance of power. Then it is not limited like the US and Soviet Union to purely strategic issues. They're talking about trade issues. They're talking about technology issues, the whole range of digital related issues. So I think the scale of the competition and the issues at hand are far, far wider. But they also have the interdependence, as we talked about. So my sense is there is going to be this a more complex, contestation. I think we should think of the 19th century Europe, where countries, Germany and England, a lot of collaboration. They fought, they did a lot of things. So my sense is we're going to see a fairly complicated confrontation between the two of them, and that is, I think, set. As Tamanna said, look, there is bipartisan consensus to push back against China and to rebuild. And it's not just a foreign policy issue; it's a domestic issue as well. The US thinks its manufacturing capacity, its skill and science and technology have been hollowed out by the Chinese competition. They need to come back, put in money, rebuild, do industrial policy, and compete with China. So I think it is a domestic policy as well. So I think it is a fairly deep and a structural conflict now. But I think we are just at the beginning of it and how this plays out. But there are also areas of cooperation. Yesterday, when President Biden and President Xi Jinping talked to each other, there is a question of climate change. There are questions of North Korea, nuclear stuff. So those issues have not gone away. So as Biden said, look, they will compete where they must. They will cooperate where they can. So it is still one as presenting both cooperation and competition rather than a complete shutdown of the relationship.
Right, Max. Let me sort of bring in Middle East a bit. I mean, you covered Middle East for a very long time. One of the outcomes of the war on terror was the invasion of Iraq in 2003, allegedly to destroy WMD stocks maintained by the Saddam Hussein regime. How has this impacted regional security in the Middle East, in your opinion?
In many ways, I mean, it's been rather catastrophic. I mean, and these things do all tie together. I mean, one of the reasons for the sad outcome in Afghanistan was because America never finished its job when it first invaded and diverted all its attention to invading Iraq on, as we discovered, false. Some of us said in the beginning, false pretexts. So there has been the kind of shock and awe did reverberate across the Middle East from the American invasion of Iraq, but with very catastrophic consequences. I mean, you can't link absolutely everything that has happened subsequently to the American invasion in Iraq, but it has had really serious consequences. I would say, one of the major ones is to turn Iran into a more belligerent player in the region. Iran confronted by this, a hostile superpower installing itself right next door to Iran in Iraq. It turned Iran into a much more aggressive player, which has had consequences all over the region. In Syria, it's played out in Lebanon, it's played out in Yemen, and so on and so forth. The toppling of Saddam as that type of leader for him to be overthrown did have a sort of a reverberation in the sense that sort of Arab nationalist dictator became rather unfashionable, and then it's had its echoes in the Arab Spring 10 years later. It was a seminal moment for the Middle East, and also ultimately it's led to America withdrawing from the Middle East. If one looks back to the previous decades, there was this notion that the world relied on Middle East oil. It was a vital ingredient. It was so important, and so on and so forth. In the end, it turns out that just wasn't true. in fact, the United States very quickly turned into the world's biggest oil producer when it started investing in its own, fracking and so on and so forth, and has actually done without the Middle East. So that whole equation of the importance of oil has changed rather radically in the wake of the invasion of Iraq, partly because America felt the need to reorganize itself. And actually, America's military imprint in the Middle East has lessened considerably since then from what it was even in the 1990s. So, there is no longer a real American presence, and it's the fallout of that has allowed other countries to intervene. Iran is one of them, which has spread its influence. Russia has spread its influence also in the direction of the Middle East, which had not at all been the case before the American invasion of Iraq. So, in terms of projection of American power, if you want world hegemony by the United States, the outcome of Iraq has been totally negative. But it's also been an object lesson for the limits of American power and what you can actually do with it, and that's equally significant. But I would say for the people of the Middle East, it has been a pretty terrible outcome, pretty terrible last 20 years in most ways. This is not in defense of Saddam Hussein or his regime, which was equally awful, but the reverberation from this massive invasion by a foreign, completely alien, culture and army into the middle of the Middle East has not had happy results in general for the region.
Right, Tamanna, let me bring you in on on an important question on everyone's mind, the credibility question here. Has the US suffered a loss of credibility due to its bungled up withdrawal from Afghanistan? What lessons US allies, partners, and adversaries around the globe are going to draw from this, in your opinion? Is there a credibility problem?
Sure. I mean, I think after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the sudden collapse of the Kabul government, most critics argue that U.S. credibility has dealt us, huge blow, that allies won't trust the U.S. to keep its commitments. I think some of these are a little bit overblown, right? That credibility is about whether an ally can, thinks what we mean that we will be able to do what we say in a given situation. I think it's context specific. I do think there has been a reputational blow in terms of when we talk about our competence, our commitment to human rights, or for playing a leadership role in the international community. I think that is real, and it will affect our credibility in the future. But I think, as others here have argued, there is a real sense that the United States in some ways is resilient. I think there will be more questions about competency and whether we really do have a plan to accomplish what we want next time. Next time we want to form a large coalition to accomplish a complicated task, right? But at the same time, that credibility comes back. And in certain cases, I definitely think in economic cases, when it comes to technology, there's a host of areas where our allies, where we work together, I think repairing credibility will take time, but I don't think it's impossible. And I think some of the criticism is a little bit overblown when it comes to U.S. credibility here. I also think, let's be honest, our allies were with us for 20 years in Afghanistan, and they saw what was happening in Afghanistan. And I think they all realized that this was an unwinnable war. It was unwinnable for us, even at the height of our surge. I think it is the method in which withdrawal happened and sort of the very public nature of the collapse of Afghanistan that really impacts, the reputation at this moment. But in the greater scheme of things, I think the U.S. can recover in terms of credibility.
Thanks. So Rajamohan, let me sort of ask you that question from a slightly different angle. If we look back at it, in some ways, the 9/11 attacks helped, or let's say the war on terror helped the facilitation of stronger Indo-US ties, bridging their views on terrorism, for instance. It also actually eventually led to the India-Pakistan peace process till about 2007-8 or so. Over 2 decades since then, the two countries have pursued closer strategic ties animated by the growing threat from China's rise. In the aftermath of the Afghan debacle, at least the withdrawal part of it, will India be forced to revisit its strategy based on a quote-unquote, quasi-alliance with the US to balance China, or will it lead to an even closer relationship with the United States? What's your sort of take on this?
No, I had a chance to cover the developments very closely after 2001. And that time I was in the Hindu, covering the diplomatic affairs. So the story was a little more complicated. So in fact, before 9/11 happened, Bush administration was sending signals to Delhi, look, forget Pakistan, China is going to be the problem. We've come here now, we believe China is our peer competitor, so we're going to focus on China, and we want you there, and forget Pakistan. So that was there. So in some sense, 9/11 complicated that the US was pulled back into into Pakistan, rebuild that relationship, and try and, so it took its eyes off on the US question, at least in the first term. So therefore, I would say it was not because of 9/11 that India-US relations improved. And I think what happened was terrorism issue, there was more sensitivity to India's interests. And more importantly, I think the US was willing to de-hyphenate the relationship with India and Pakistan. They said, look, we're going to deal with both of us. We have different interests. So I think it helped to sort out the relationship. But you couldn't, counterfactually, you could argue if there was no 9/11, India and US would have done perhaps even more focused on the East. But today, I think on the credibility question or further, look, when America is saying, look, we're going to turn to Indo-Pacific, to keep fighting a war that was unwinnable was not going to increase the credibility. And all indications, whether it is Japan, Australia, India, they see, look, a concentration. India is slightly different from Japan. For Asia, a focus on China would be welcome, other than being stuck in the Middle East. For India, certainly, while the American withdrawal, we would have loved to have the Americans fight there forever, till the last American, but that was not going to happen. Politics, we know as a democracy, has only limited traction. So I think we were preparing to deal with that reality. So my sense is, for India at least, there will be problems in Afghanistan from the American withdrawal. But there is also going to be huge opportunities to strengthen cooperation, and we're going to see some of that at the Quad Summit later this month. So my sense is, now India and US relationship is no longer tied to Pakistan or to Afghanistan or to the terrorism issue. There are much bigger issues. So I think there is some sense of an autopilot out there, and my sense is things will keep moving irrespective of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Max, this is an important question on everyone's mind. Let me also bring you in on that. Do you think the disorderly withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan would cast doubts on the minds of its allies about the credibility of its commitment regarding their security? What's your take on that?
Yeah, to a certain extent. Of course, the initial reaction by a lot of the press and commentariat has been, look at America, what a catastrophe, what an unreliable ally. Then in the second breath, you find actually quite a different sort of assessment, I think, as Raja was suggesting. I mean, I think that there was in a clear-eyed view, Afghanistan, following, soon after the fall of the Taliban in Afghanistan, way back in 2001, was of very little strategic value to the United States, objectively speaking. It's not an important country for America. I mean, in many ways, the extraordinary thing is to have stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years at immense cost, which is really a reflection of a slightly perverse kind of incentive structure inside, Washington, actually, where people were getting their medals from Afghanistan and so on, and no one wanted to end the war. So in some ways, ending the Afghanistan war, messy, disastrous, stupid, ugly, costly, it is actually, to some, if you think a bit more objectively, it restores some American credibility to a certain degree. There are a lot of American allies who invested a lot in Afghanistan and didn't see any way out, and now there's a way out. It's over, it's finished. They don't have to worry about it anymore. So I think, in Delhi, for example, there's a lot of hand-wringing about, my goodness, these Americans are kind of useless. And India has had a long history of discovering stupid mistakes made by America and feeling happy that it wasn't involved in things like Vietnam and so on. And that is quite true. But I think India may also find that America having exited Afghanistan, America is no longer vulnerable in Afghanistan. America can possibly be a more objective and realistic ally. It has no troubles with, has no reason to placate Pakistan now, for example, as it did in the past, in order to keep its toehold in Afghanistan. So I think there's from the Indian perspective, there's something, so there are some positive sides to this that haven't been, adequately seen. But also, there should have been more realism, I think, in general, in how in America, about America's involvement in Afghanistan, as with America's involvement in Europe, for example. I mean, people take it for granted, and it's not a good idea to take such things for granted. People happily live under the American sort of security power umbrella. Well, actually, you ought to look after yourself a bit more. A country like India also should perhaps have had its own better intelligence about what was happening in India, instead of simply blaming the Americans for making a mess and leaving in a hurry. So I think we are all more realistic, perhaps, now about what the Americans can and cannot do, and that's possibly a good thing. And I think the Americans will also be more careful about their use of power. So I think we're at a turning point, and from now on there will be tests of America's credibility. But I think people shouldn't just assume that this whole Afghan adventure is one single great object lesson in America's failure.
Right. Professor Rajamohan, the Taliban has apparently invited Pakistan, China, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Qatar to attend the inaugural ceremony of the interim government. Earlier, China and Russia had actually abstained from voting in the UNSC resolution on Afghanistan. What does it suggest to you? Does it suggest that the making of a new regional consensus of sorts with global implications, or this is a friendship of convenience? What do you make of this?
In fact, you talked about the inauguration of the Taliban's return. They were initially planning to do it on today, September 11th. But I think Pakistanis must have told them, look, don't be so stupid. I mean, we can be stupid, but not so stupid that you do it today. They seem to have postponed it for another day. But look, there is going to be no consensus. You can send out invitations. I mean, already the Russians seems to be having second thoughts. The Iranians, in fact, in the first week after August 15th, they said, we look forward to engaging, blah, blah, blah. If you see the last 1 week, they've been the strongest, only country that's besides Tajikistan to oppose what's going on in Panjshir. They've accused Pakistan of sending troops into Panjshir Valley. So there is, and they see no Hazaras or Shias in the cabinet, and the Persian, and the Tajiks are close to the Persians, so you see them being victimized. So I don't see, everyone is going to make the calculation. If there is a consensus today, only two people have consensus. One is Beijing, one is Rawalpindi. They have a consensus of how to deal with Pakistan. They're partners in this. And I think China thinks Pakistan can deliver. And Pakistan has delivered a new government. It has delivered Taliban back into Kabul. So and unlike in the 90s, where Pakistan had the manpower on the ground, but didn't have the money, nor a vision of what to do with, free run they had in Afghanistan. Today, maybe the Pakistani soldier and the Chinese capitalist can turn Afghanistan around. I mean, that is the dream. Now, but there are Iranian concerns, there are Indian concerns, there are Russians. We still don't know which way they're going to go. So I think, unless we assume Taliban has come to love capitalism, and they will create a reasonable order. I mean, you could be authoritarian ruler who facilitates capitalism, or but this is a pre-modern, pre-capitalist formation, which first wants to fix the women, fix all the minorities. You think they can build capitalism? I mean, I would be amazed. So how much the Pakistanis can sell this pup? The pup will show its colors. And I think already you've seen in 2 weeks. But that doesn't mean the West won't engage them. They still need Pakistan to deliver humanitarian assistance. They need them to get the evacuations done. And Pakistan is the one-shop window to talk to the Taliban. So all that will happen. But the contradictions are just beginning to unfold. And my sense is the biggest one we've seen since is the Iranian problem. They didn't attend the Troika Plus meetings. I don't know how many people will go. Russians have said they're not going to attend the inauguration. So we have issues. So this dream that you can produce a new consensus, this is what the Pakistani line is. Good luck to them, but knowing the region, I mean, my sense is dream on, I would say.
Right. Max, that's as Professor Rajamohan said, if there is any consensus, that consensus is between Beijing and Rawalpindi. What do you think is going to be China's game plan in all of this? What is China's approach to Taliban going to be like? Will the Taliban be able to deliver on China's interest in training in extremism in Xinjiang? What's your sort of estimate at this point of time?
Well, I think you touch on the biggest question mark in the world right now, which is what does China want? I mean, and we're all slightly puzzling out that. And there are dark views, there are lighter views. What does China want? I don't think we actually really know so well what China wants. But I think we can say, how does China behave? One can see that in general, what characterizes Chinese behavior in the world, on the world stage, is ultra extreme pragmatism. In a sort of one would imagine that China would want nothing to do, in an objective fashion, nothing to do with an outfit like the Taliban. I mean, the Chinese abhor this sort of Islamist extremism. They have their own methods for dealing with it in China. The Taliban, after all, the current new prime minister of Afghanistan is the chap who blew up the Bamiyan Buddhas, the greatest sort of, artifact of a sort of Eastern Chinese civilization. Chinese, you might call it Chinese, Buddhism, although they are communist, it's part of the same civilization to some extent. The most, impressive monument to Buddhism to the west of China was blown up by these same people. I mean, they have nothing in common. However, pragmatism is pragmatism. And I think that, that this is a test of the China-Pakistan relationship. As Raja very accurately said, I think the Chinese will consider now that Pakistan has delivered. Pakistan may have been promising this for years and years and years and years. Just give us time, just give us time. Now Pakistan has installed the regime it wants in pretty much in Kabul. I think the Chinese, though, will be waiting to see what happens next. I mean, what the Chinese have done so far, I mean, they have given a bit of diplomatic recognition. They proffered a little dose of aid. I think the sum was $31 million. This is mostly vaccines, soap, stuff like that. It's not going to make a difference. It's obviously just dipping a toe in the water. I think the Chinese will wait to see how things pan out. Obviously, they're ultimately, there may be rewards in in Afghanistan, such as its extraordinary mineral wealth, and also projecting Chinese power. And we shouldn't forget also that China is an actually borders on Afghanistan, although there isn't even a road linking them. There's basically a donkey track that links the two countries in this tiny corridor. But so China will be projecting its influence in Afghanistan, but I don't know if they actually have a plan right now. I mean, I don't know what sort of Afghan expertise they have, even the Chinese. So they're really relying on Pakistan to guide them in this for the time being. But I would suspect that if we look, 10 years from now, there's almost no question China will be Afghanistan's major trading partner, biggest investor. This is very, very likely to be the outcome.
Right. Tamanna, you have dealt with the Taliban while you were part of the US administration. So let me ask you the most difficult question. How capable and interested would the Taliban be in reining in terrorist groups and extremist outfits operating out of Afghanistan? I know that's not an easy question to ask, but you're the right person to answer that.
I mean, I think that's the million-dollar question for the United States, right? Is the basis of the February 2020 deal really was, look, we need to get out, but can you take care of the international terrorist problem? And I think it is yet to be seen. You're asking it absolutely right. There's a capacity question and there's a willingness question. I think it depends on the group. So willingness, for example, in terms of KP, in terms of Daesh, is high. It's, the Taliban see them as the biggest external spoiler, as the biggest threat to their power and their regime. And I think they have complete willingness. Now, whether they actually have capacity, I would argue, is a much more difficult question. When you are sitting outside of government and fighting guerrilla warfare, it's much easier to win. When you are trying to consolidate a whole country and hold it, IS is far more, in a sense, has a lot more leverage. It can launch opportunistic attacks like we've seen at the airport already, and the Taliban may not have the capacity to do so. I think the Taliban will suffer from lack of expertise with a lot of experts trying to leave the country and unwilling to be part of the regime, but also, economic interests. I think this also ties into not just West's concern about international terrorism, but it ties to China's plans as well. I mean, as the other speakers have talked about, it's unsure what China will do. There's two parts: China as the economic help that the Taliban need and want. But for China, Afghanistan is actually, while important, a very small, minuscule market. And I don't think the economic, minerals, other things will not be determinative for China as it looks out on all of BRI. Afghanistan is not that important. But the second part of controlling terrorists and not allowing groups to come into Xinjiang or to influence Xinjiang, they have been long looking for this. I mean, when I was in government, we had conversations with the Chinese because we felt that was the one area where the US and China had a shared interest in Afghanistan. I think the problem is that China is unwilling, and I think this is why the Taliban would want to work with them, to actually push Afghanistan or the Taliban to do anything, so they can express what they want, but they've really outsourced that to Pakistan. And I think Pakistan may not be capable of getting the Taliban to actually keep the terrorists in line. I mean, I think you can see that in just the TTP attacks in Pakistan. If the Taliban is unable to control the TTP, I think larger groups and more more capable militant groups may not be able to be controlled by the Taliban.
Do you think this is going to be a clever strategy of picking and choosing by the Taliban? You go after some, you sustain some, you protect some. Is that likely to be the strategy in your sort of estimation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's in their mind, it's not picking and choosing, right? There are groups that are allied with them. There are groups that they see as good groups who have long had ties with them, who have long supported them, whether it comes to capacity, funding, inroads into places, whether it's Al-Qaeda and others, groups like TTP who have given bay'ah to them. They are not going to go against those groups. And then there are groups very clearly like Daesh who are, against them, who are, I think, twofold. One, they disagree with Daesh and Daesh's sort of ideology. They have a completely separate ideology. But more than that, what people don't look at, many members of Daesh are people who have left the Taliban, who have rejected Taliban and joined groups like Daesh. So part of it is maintaining the cohesion, which is so important to the Taliban internally. I think this interim government is a perfect reflection of their need to maintain their cohesion as much as they'd like to make. Let's say there are leaders within the Taliban who understand the importance of an inclusive government, one that represents Tajiks and others. The need for cohesion and unity within the organization is so important that they would rather come out with a government that you are seeing right now.
Right, Professor Rajamohan, India has been quite hesitant about opening contacts with the Taliban. Do you think India will be able to, or how will India be able to secure its interests vis-a-vis terrorism, on the terrorism question? And will Pakistan play the spoil sport? Let's put it differently. What should be India's Afghanistan policy at this point of time, in your opinion?
No, a word on terrorism and the what Tamanna pointed to, the contradictions of Taliban. Look, if they behave reasonably and they do what they said they will do, which is they will control the terrorist organizations, the groups are going to say, including TTP, these guys are sold out to the Americans. These are American lackeys. And our whole job has been to fight the American lackeys. There's one more American lackey, like the previous Ghani government. So the ideological problem that Taliban has is fundamental. And if they can't control them, the neighbors, everyone is going to create problems for them. So unless you had a genius, someone of the character of Mao or Stalin who can, ride over these contradictions, build a nation from out of extraordinarily difficult circumstances, we're not seeing them. And in fact, the few moderates that seem to be visible, like Baradar, have been, have lost ground in the political competition of the last few weeks, thanks to Pakistani friends. So I think there you are. Already the moderates have lost ground, and I think that's going to be the problem for everyone. But India, I think the fact that ISI chief goes there, pulls out these people that Max was talking about, the people from nowhere, and the expectation that Mr. Baradar would become the prime minister, was shattered because Baradar was in Pakistani jails for 8 years. Let's not forget that. So the internal balance, Pakistan has tilted in favor of one set of people, especially the Haqqanis and the more conservative factions of the Pashtun tribes. And I think that is going to be, that is a reality. So if India could have gone to Doha, talked to these guys like Stanexai, we were talking, he said all the nice things. But poor chap, he's become a deputy foreign minister. So I think, look, Pakistan is the player in the politics of Taliban. They're not waiting for India to show up and say, look, India too is a buddy-buddy with the new regime. So I think India should be, sometimes it's good to be patient. Just wait. Let the contradictions unfold. At this point, I think India should focus on, if Pakistan lets us, to deliver humanitarian assistance or work with Iran or Tajikistan, whoever we can, deliver humanitarian assistance, which is very, very important, I think, in the next few weeks. That is going to be the big issue. And the big strategic questions of how they behave, those, I think we just have to wait and see how it plays out. I mean, so we don't have to be in every play in the front and center of the stage. So sometimes it's good to be stepping back and let the contradictions unfold, because this is just the beginning of the drama. And I don't think we should be so eager to be seen in the Act 1 play of the Afghan, scene 1 of Afghan drama. So I think there was a British Indian tradition called masterly inactivity. You step back, you wait and watch, don't rush in. I mean, when it's not really worth it. So I think India, as a large power, has a play. It's working, it's talking to the Americans, it has a line to the Russians, it is part of the SCO, it's in the sanctions committee, it's friends in the Gulf, Saudis in the UAE, they have the money bags, though Qatar has outsmarted them today. Those guys are going to come back. So there are enough people of India's friends who are interested and enough convergence. So I think we should step back. So I think what Max was saying earlier, look, I don't think anybody in the government has said, look, Americans should not leave, American credibility. That's really the public discourse. Well, the government had signals. Obama said in 2014, he wants to wind it by 2014. Trump actually signed a deal with the Emirate, and Biden has just completed it. So I think we knew that this was going to come. So we should wait and see. I would say there'll be more than enough contradictions to deal with in the days ahead. And I think if Pakistan wants to be the interlocutor, take charge of the tar baby, I would say be my guest.
But Max, where do you stand on that? I mean, there's an interesting argument in Delhi that, at the end of the day, this is going to be controlled by Pakistanis. Whatever is going to happen in Afghanistan is going to be, remotely controlled by the Pakistanis. So there's no point in sweating it. So let's sort of wait and watch, and don't. There's no need to sort of get into a conversation with the Taliban at all. Where do you stand on this, or do you think that there's another argument which sort of talks about the need to dehyphenate the Pakistan policy and Afghanistan policy? Which way do you think India should ideally take, in your opinion?
Well, I keep backing away from these either-or alternatives, and I would agree very strongly with Raja about the need for strategic patience. I mean, what the outcome we have right now in Afghanistan is that Islamabad is the address. The Pakistanis have got what they want. They're the people that are going to be kind of calling the shots, or at least pretending to call the shots, until everything goes screwy all over again, which is quite likely, as Raja was suggesting. So I think it's quite wise for India to wait. But I don't think, for example, a lot of the debate that goes particularly on in the press in India about should we recognize, should we not recognize, should we not talk to the Taliban? Well, of course, India should talk to the Taliban. I mean, it would be silly not to. And it's always good to have channels. You need them. I mean, you need them for all kinds of reasons. And India has discovered that in the past, in, for example, hijacking incidents when they had no one to talk to. It's actually useful to have people to talk to. So I don't think that's actually an alternative that's reasonable. But I think also, as Raja was saying, it's important to keep. I mean, India has a huge investment in Afghanistan. I mean, $3 billion in value over 20 years, but also just the amount of Indian aid, humanitarian assistance, human ties, and so on and so forth. I think it's really important to keep that up. And India also has an enormous number of Afghan refugees in India. I mean, the official number is something like, I think, 60,000, but many people believe it's perhaps double that number actually living in India. So India has a responsibility to those people and to maintain those kind of ties. And also humanitarian aid at this very crucial juncture is important, So I think, one has to kind of, not so much, it's not a matter of decoupling, dehyphenating, Afghanistan from Pakistan, but I think India does have an investment in the Afghan people that is worth preserving and maintaining for long-term Indian goals, if nothing else. So I think that's significant.
Happymon, I was not saying don't talk at all. I mean, I think we need to engage them. We need to talk to them, but keep your expectations limited. So engaging them doesn't mean you're going to be the principal actor. Do keep channels open wherever you can get. That itself will make the Pakistanis sweat. So that's not a bad thing. So keep talking, but that doesn't mean you don't recognize the current disposition of power. And it is not as if today Pakistan controls, but the contradictions, as I said, look, the current regime in Kabul is not a cohesive force. There will be others. Look, I think historically, if you say India, whoever is in Kabul has problems with Islamabad because nobody loves their hegemonic neighbor. So I think at least one faction will inevitably turn to India. So I think you've got to at least give the time for that to emerge rather than we must be in the front and center of the situation at this point.
I have one more question, and I'll take that question to all three of you, and then we will end the program. And that is basically, are the foundations of the US-led liberal international order less resilient today in the wake of the global war on terror? Let me start with Tamanna, and then we'll go to Professor Mohan, and then end with Max. So Tamanna, over to you.
I would quote Dr. Mohan in his recent articles that, the state system is so strong post this. I think that is an important factor to think about that. At the beginning, after 9/11, people really argued that the state-to-state conflict would not be what we are thinking about, that it is non-state actors that would become the dominant threat to us. And I think that in 20 years, we have seen that that's not the case, that it is still state-to-state conflict. And whether you are, it's really proxies that you are dealing with in all of these non-state actors. And so there is a state behind it. I think that's one part. In terms of the liberal order, I think what has happened in the 20 years by, this, whether you call it a bipolar world or just so many different powers rising, as others have talked about, that it's not that the US is losing, that there are other powers rising. It is much harder, I think, to call out and hold accountable threats to that, to basically illiberalism that is rising in many countries, right? Whether it's human rights violations, censorship, freedom of civil society, minority rights, all of these issues that we're seeing not in just one place, but definitely across South Asia, across Southeast Asia. These illiberal tendencies are just much harder to call out. And I think as countries become more powerful and enmeshed with each other, for example, why is it so hard to call out China on certain things? It is really because you cannot have a zero-sum game anymore. It is not that you are either on this side of the liberal order or on that side of the liberal order. You can't make those choices. And even as we talk about strategic competition with China, I think the point has been made. The US can ask for certain things, can push for certain things, but in the end, we are enmeshed with them in certain ways, economically first and foremost, that make it very difficult to push what we traditionally think as the international liberal order. That being said, I think norms and practices, definitely under the Biden administration, democracy and these things will be at the forefront. How much credibility and how much power do we have to enforce those, I think, is the question that we need to ask.
Right, Professor Rajamohan.
Look, I think the liberal international order is a bit of a myth. It was, this has never been liberal or international or ordered in that sense. It's really post-90 construction in Washington talk shops, which I think we shouldn't take all of that seriously that comes out of Washington. Look at Afghanistan. When the Soviet intervention took place, it was the Americans who mobilized the Saudis and other jihadis. Come and fight the godless Soviet communists. And here was a communist regime. Bad they were, commies, but they were doing reforms, probably too fast. It was a modernist, progressive, communist, yes, but a progressive regime trying to modernize Afghanistan. Here, the United States And entire Western world, the Chinese, everybody comes here. I remember the congressman as a young professional in Delhi, showing up in Peshawar, standing with the long beards, longer than mine. Freedom fighters. These were the freedom fighters. We're going to use this to produce freedom. Look, we've seen that. Now, if you tell me, look, Americans were doing liberalism all the time. In Delhi, you did not see a gun before 1979. What the jihadi business did to South Asia, to Pakistan, to what Zia did to Pakistan because of the Afghan war, what it did to religious fundamentalism of all kinds in the subcontinent. So Afghan war didn't start in 2001. It started in 79. In fact, we would say Iran and Pakistan, Shah of Iran and Pakistan, tried to destabilize the reasonably decent monarchy that existed out there. And we had a series of events that came in after that. So the worst elements, the most pre-modern elements were brought into South Asia to sit in the Afghan frontier and to fight what was a reasonably decent regime. And that is the consequences that led to bin Laden, who was a child, the bastard child of the jihad that Americans backed and the whole West backed. So it was, we shouldn't forget that and take the slogans too easily. That is a longer history. Right. So I think I'm not criticizing the Americans now. What has happened is water under the bridge. Can we now at least work together to produce a reasonable order? That's what we have to think of, rather than setting the standards which you can't enforce. And go back to before, after Second World War. Was Spain a democracy to sit in NATO? Was Greece a democracy? Was Turkey a democracy? So the suggestion somehow the West was always democratic and the institutions they created were always democratic is a myth. And at least those of us in India, we shouldn't buy into this. So I think it's good to tell the American friends, look, calm down. There are problems here. What you've done, unintended consequences have produced a set of results. So let's find ways of dealing with it rather than coming up with one more slogan and expecting everyone to buy into that.
Max, Professor Rajamohan has taken issue with each part of it, liberal, international, and order. Where do you stand on that?
I agree with him wholeheartedly, actually. I think he's absolutely right. And I think he's also very right that, a lot of the so-called order that we talk about is an order that was constructed after World War II in very specific circumstances. That is a long time ago. That is many generations ago. And actually, the thought should be now of building new structures. That should be where our thoughts should be, not of how to resurrect or keep alive something that is, quite ancient and creaky. The other thing about the liberal world is I think, Afghanistan is one thing, but we live in the midst of a much bigger event, which is the, COVID pandemic. And, I think that has concentrated minds to a certain degree on the failings inside every society, including the so-called, democratic liberal societies. There's an awful lot of house cleaning to do, and I think there should be a concentration on getting, if we want to see a liberal world order, those countries that consider themselves liberal should be getting their own houses in order, more seriously. And the results of the pandemic should have taught a lesson that it's very important to do that. We need to get our democracies working better. We need to get our judicial systems working better. We need to produce more justice and equity and so on, and better standards of living for our own people in the so-called liberal world before starting to think about wading into other places.
Fascinating discussion, great insights. Thank you all so much for joining the show. Professor Rajamohan, Max, Tamanna, thank you so much for sparing your time and joining the show. And thank you everyone for watching this live show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.